So my why, it's kind of cliche, but I love kids. And I think a lot of times when people say that they want to become a teacher, a lot of times they say, oh, I always knew I wanted to be a teacher. It was always my calling. But for me, I think it took me a while to figure out that I wanted to be a teacher. I've always loved working with kids, and I always loved helping people out. Like, throughout my educational experience, I was always one that wanted to, like, tutor my friends, edit their papers, like, let me help you. Like, I'm going to be annoying, let me help you. I want to help you. So I'm just always kind of that person that wants to help people learn, help them understand. So this presentation, I have a little introduction for myself, but we've kind of spent quite a bit of time together this week so far, so I probably won't go over all of it. Then I'll talk about what a lesson plan is, how to plan a lesson, a mock lesson. I'm going to show you guys a lesson that I actually taught this year to my third graders. And then we'll talk about why it's important to make a lesson plan. And then I'll kind of talk about my personal experience and kind of that progression with lesson planning that I've had since I've been in college. And if you guys have questions, we'll do that. So my name's Jillian, Jill, whatever you want to call me, I don't care. I'm from Winnemucca, Nevada, and I came to Eastern in the fall of 2016, and I decided to pursue education. I got my Bachelor of Science in Multidisciplinary Studies with minors in ESOL and History. And just this last year, I got my Master of Arts in Teaching degree. And I've applied, but I don't have my license yet, but I'm going to have an Oregon teaching license with a ESOL endorsement. What is a lesson plan? So I want you to it's kind of small, sorry. I want you to look at these questions, and I want you to talk to the people around you. I ask, what does a teacher do when putting together a lesson plan? What are the components of a lesson plan, and what is its purpose? I'm going to talk to the people that are kind of nearby. You might not know entirely, but just kind of discuss.
Yes, I have.
All right, wrap up your thoughts. All right. Want to hear some of your ideas. What do we think? What does a teacher do when putting together a lesson plan? What are the components of a lesson plan? What is its purpose? Who's willing to share?
When they put together a lesson plan, they're determining how they can meet the standards, but still keep the kids engaged and still keep it fun. And they can add in more stuff too that doesn't necessarily meet the standards, but helps them be a well-rounded student.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Standards are important. Other ideas? Yeah.
I think for its purpose is not just organization, but also a way to refine the method in which you teach. Either the way you approach a certain subject if it's been difficult for students to understand, or making notes on what to add.
Yeah, you guys are like rock stars. You're like hitting everything.
Another purpose is kind of just writing out what the student's real world connection is, like why they're learning what they're learning.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Being organized.
Yeah, definitely.
So, is it okay if I skip to the next question?
Yeah, go ahead. Whichever one of the questions you can answer.
So for components and purpose, I said that you need to address the standard, you need to make a topic, you have to have specific objectives, step-by-step procedures, and then you have to list out your guided and independent practice, and you also need to assess. So whether it's a test or just partner talk, and a reflection is really important, because if the lesson plan doesn't work, then you obviously need to adjust it. And the purpose is just to keep you on track and to make sure that your students are getting everything that's required.
Yep. Perfect. And a lot of the things that she talked about, it totally is encompassed by our EOU lesson plan template, which I will show you in just a second. I provided a couple of definitions. Don't feel like you have to write those down. Those are Google basic definitions. But some of these bullet points that I put for the purpose, your lesson plan kind of functions as a roadmap. It's kind of going to help you figure out how you're going to get from here to here, and the end goal is that there's student learning, right? There's short-term and long-term lesson plans. Your short-term is going to be okay, what am I doing in math at 9 o'clock? right? It's that one lesson, that specific lesson plan for that day, for that time period, for that content area. But you're also going to have some long-term plans as well. So, like said before, there are standards that you're going to be teaching throughout the year. And the long-term planning is going to kind of help you figure out, where am I starting? Where am I ending, right? You're going to figure out, like for third grade, we started out with kind of like basics, like addition, subtraction, and math. We wouldn't start the year with fractions, right? That wouldn't make sense. So you're kind of figuring out where you're going to start so you can kind of make that progression in that student learning so that you're going from, those entry-level skills to kind of where they're going to be that's going to help them progress to that next grade level. A lot of us also said it helps with organization. And for those of you like me who are like a very type A personality, really got to have it like, I'm color-coded, I'm like by the minute, it's really, it's crazy, but it works for me. It kind of provides that organization for you. And it also helps kind of guide your thinking, right? And then it also is important because it allows you to really plan your analysis and your evaluation, right? Because when you're doing a lesson plan, you need to make sure that you have a way to check that the students are learning, right? If I just were to think of a lesson and I'm going to say, like, you guys will understand how a lesson plan works. Like, how am I going to know, right? So you have to, when you're making a lesson plan, you have to figure out how you're going to make that learning objective, that goal, measurable, because you have to be able to actually analyze and kind of grade and look at their work. Sorry, my shoe's falling off. To be able to analyze whether your students are learning or not. And maybe not even if they're learning or not, but to what extent, right? If you need to kind of take more time, focus on something, slow it down, or if you're like, oh man, these guys are rocking it, I can kind of speed it up, move on a little bit quicker. This is kind of the EUU lesson plan template. I kind of broke it down into some chunks. So I won't go into like super crazy detail because I don't want you guys to fall asleep. But in the lesson plan, you're going to include all of that basic information, right? Your name, grade level. The mentor teacher is, if you're in a practicum or you're student teaching, that's the classroom that you're in, the name of that teacher. You're going to incorporate the subject you're teaching, the unit, lesson title, length of the lesson. A lot of times, like in your undergrad, before you actually kind of have that experience in the classroom, it's kind of tough to figure out how much time you're going to need for a lesson. But once you are actually in a classroom, you're going to have like a very specific schedule, and each content is going to be broken up into a specific block. So like, I'm going to be showing you an ELA lesson that I did this year, and I think the length of the lesson I said was 25 minutes, but it's kind of, you have that specific block. Your central focus is kind of like, what's the point, right? What are the kids going to be learning? What are those related skills that they're going to need to be able to kind of progress through that learning task? And then I think, Martin, you mentioned the real world connection. That's super important. How many of you have ever sat in a class and you're like, why am I learning this? I'm never going to use this. You can be honest. I have.
I had to answer that question, and I have come up with an answer.
What was your answer?
So, kid asked me, like, why do I need to learn all this nonsense? Like algebra.
Yeah.
And I was like, listen, we don't need you to learn why x squared equals whatever. We need you to put together the ability to think and problem solve.
Yep.
It's not that you can do 2 + 2 is 4. It's that you understand that you need to be able to put the pieces together. That was the answer I came up with.
That's good. That's good. You're thinking on your feet. A lot of times kids are going to ask you questions like that. You kind of have to be able to think on your feet and be like, well, this is why. Because if you say, oh, good question, they're going to be like, come on. Like, move on, lady. And then you're also going to include your content standards and your objective. In Oregon, you're going to be using the Common Core state standards in a lot of states. Those are for language arts, math, reading, all that good stuff. And your objective is going to come straight from the standard. So if your standard was something like, students will, can you give me a sample standard?
Okay, students will, do you want ELA or math?
Whatever.
Students will be able to decode multi-syllable words.
Okay. So then for your objective, would you say something like, they'll know how to add 2 plus 2? No, that doesn't make any sense at all. So your objective, a lot of times, is going to include that very specific language from your standard. And sometimes standards, you'll find, are going to include like 6 different skills. You might not teach all of those skills in that one lesson, right? You might just teach like 1 or 2, okay? And it's better that way because it's going to be way easier to assess a kid's ability to perform 1 skill compared to 6, right? Then we're going to move into academic language. This is kind of where you're including that like specific content vocabulary. And then Tanya was talking earlier about like ELLs. Sometimes those types of kids really struggle in class because they don't understand instructional vocabulary. So a lot of those words that you just kind of use and you kind of know immediately, like examine or justify, kind of those skills that tell you how to perform a task. Sometimes kids don't know what those words mean. So if you're like, justify your answer, they're gonna be like, what? You want me to what? And then it's always important to include the materials you're going to use and how you're going to integrate technology. And I think that in the world we're living in today, you're probably going to integrate technology into just about every single lesson. Assessment, that's how you're going to analyze their learning. It needs to be something that's measurable. So maybe you have a worksheet where they need to complete 3 problems, and you're going to be able to quickly determine whether they're completing it correctly or not. Maybe it's writing a paragraph or filling in a sentence, or it could be an exam. It could be a turn and talk, and you're just listening to what they're saying, right? There's all different types of assessments. Differentiation, I think that was a super scary word for me in my undergrad because it's talking about all of the ways that you're going to make sure that all of your different learners are going to have what they need to be able to complete the learning task. So I want you to think about what type of learner you are. How many of you need it to be hands-on for you to really learn? You really have to like do it with your hands, yeah? How about visual learners? Okay, what about like this, like direct instruction? I'm just talking your ear off. Some of us, yeah? Yeah, so even just thinking about how many different learners we have in this class, you're going to have that in every single classroom that you're in. There's all these different types of learners, so you're going to have to kind of figure out how you're going to accommodate for that, right? And then you're going to have kiddos who are on IEPs, right? They have very specific needs, like maybe they work with a para. Maybe they receive like push-out services during certain times where somebody's taking them out of the classroom and they're getting specific instruction. You're going to have your like high flyers, super crazy smart kids, right? If you plan a lesson and they fly through it in like 5 minutes, they're going to be bored out of their minds, right? And that's when you kind of start to get into some of those behavior issues. It's not because they want to misbehave. They're just bored. They need something to do, right? They're not being challenged enough. So you've got all those different types of learners. And I don't say that to intimidate you. But yes.
So I have a question that I just want to ask if you agree. So in my class last year, Ms. Barnes told us that just because they're advanced doesn't mean that they have to do more.
Yep.
So like, it's not always giving them more work. It's like the same amount of work, but more difficult, right?
Yep. Yeah, so if you're just piling on like extra questions, extra problems, they're also going to be bored and they're going to be like, why do I have to do all this work when they don't have to, right? So it's kind of shifting how you're presenting that to them. So maybe you give them a different style of question that's kind of like higher level thinking. Like I can think of an example. If I were to give you guys like an article, a reading passage, I might give the majority of the class a question that they can like easily find in the text, right? But then one of those gifted like higher level thinker kids, you might give them a question that's going to make them like think about the material that's in front of them, but they have to do something additional with it. They have to kind of analyze what's being taught to them. So it's kind of that like next step, next level. But if you give them just more work, they're gonna be like, dude, come on. And then this is just going to be your lesson sequence. So it's kind of like your launch, how you're going to start it, grab the attention of your class, and then your lesson. What we say a lot at EUU, you want to have an I do, we do, you do. So your I do is where you're doing that like direct instruction, I'm teaching you guys something. We do is your guided practice. So we're going to kind of do it together and I'll kind of guide you through it. And then you do, that's where you're going to have your independent practice. You guys get to actually do it on your own and kind of practice it without any assistance. And then closure, it's where you wrap it up and kind of have that reflection. This is pretty similar to the lesson plan that you were showing me too. Sorry, I'm gonna have to get a drink of water. So, if I were to ask you guys to plan a lesson right now, what do you think you would do first? Any subject. You guys can talk to the people around you. What do you think, how would you prioritize that list of stuff in that lesson plan? What do you think you need to do first, next? You can talk to the people around you. All right. I'm going to kind of show you a general list. It's not like this is how it has to be done, but this is just kind of like a good plan, a good guide to follow. So first, you might want to identify the learning objective and your goals. So what are your students going to be learning, right? What's the point of that lesson? Then you're going to want to make sure that it's going to align with your appropriate standards, right? Because you have very specific standards for each of your grade levels. So you want to make sure that what you're teaching is going to align with your standards. You can teach stuff that doesn't align with your standards, but then you're losing time to actually teach your standards, right? Assessment, how are the students going to demonstrate learning? So that's something that you want to be measurable. Who can give me an example of something that would be a measurable assessment?
You give a little prompt at the end of that lesson, and they have either like a written or a verbal response.
Yeah, like a writing prompt, or they have to like give a verbal response. What else?
You do like an exit ticket.
Yeah, exit ticket. Those are nice, easy, quick. Other ideas?
You can have review table discussions.
Yeah.
Observe.
Yeah. It doesn't always have to be something that they're physically turning in. You could kind of have those, just like those observations, you're kind of listening to what they're saying. And you kind of have, if you do that though, you kind of have to think like, what are some of those things that I'm wanting them to include in their response? And then as you're listening, kind of listening for those specific things. What else?
Maybe like a what we know list type thing, like
Yeah.
what we know, what we don't know, questions.
Yeah,
some of that.
like a KWL chart?
Yeah.
Anything else? Okay. Then you're going to want to engage your students, right? And in the lesson plan that we use at EUU, it's called your launch. We're going to want to find a way to like really get everybody excited about what they're learning about, right? You kind of want to like get everybody hyped, get them into it. So you're not just like, here's your article with 10 questions, have fun. Then you're going to kind of plan your sequence, your I do, we do, you do, and that might look different in every lesson, and your order might switch around, but you're going to kind of figure out how you're going to actually teach it. Then you need to wrap it up. What are you going to do to make sure that you're kind of having that closure for your lesson, right? So you're not just like, okay, next, now we're going to recess. You're kind of having that final discussion. Need to include your materials and your technology, because if you wrote up your lesson plan and then all of a sudden you can't show up, can't teach that day, and you have to give it to a substitute teacher, and you don't have your materials and stuff listed or ready for them, they're going to be like, oh, how am I supposed to teach this lesson? And then whatever you're missing, like in that lesson plan, there's all those extra little boxes. Maybe you're including like vocabulary or all those other little things. That's kind of where you can start to fill in all those extra little pieces. Oh, I have it right in my hands. I don't know why I'm looking for a mouse. Blonde moment, sorry. So, I mean, the next couple of slides, I have like my actual full lesson plan, but that's really boring and I won't make you guys read that. So, yes. I'm going to pull up, if you guys don't know this, if you want to share a Google anything with someone and you want it to force them to make a copy so they don't have to, it gives them editing access without editing your actual thing. You can this is not the greatest tutorial obviously, but you can kind of backspace to the last slash and type the word copy, and then it forces them to copy when they try to click on the link. Yeah. Teacher hacks. This was an instructional tool material, I guess, that my roommate and I put together this year because she was placed in the other third grade classroom at my school. So we put together this little Google Slides presentation for our third graders. So this is a lesson about cause and effect. So the day before we had introduced the topic, we had shown them just a picture, and it was kind of an inquiry-based lesson. So on the left side, there was a picture of two kids getting ready to jump into a mud puddle, and then beside it, they were absolutely covered in mud, and there was a woman doing this at them. And so we're kind of trying to get them to figure out what's going on, kind of lead them into figuring out that how is that a cause and effect relationship. So we introduce them to the lesson, and something that's really helpful when you're teaching kids new vocabulary is to give them emotion or a song or something. We're not going to do a song, but for us, I had my kids, I would say, what's our cause? And they would say, sorry, I'm out of breath. I'm I haven't worked out once since basketball season ended, I'll be completely honest. Okay, so your effect is going to be what happens, and I would have them do this, so you guys can do it. What happens? Awesome. And your cause is why it happened. So I would have them do it 6 times, and then they kind of warm up their brains. So that's kind of my launch to the lesson. I would have them, I won't treat you guys like third graders, but that's what I would do in my lesson. And then in my class, they all had Chromebooks, and so they would all get signed in, yada, yada, pull this up. And then I would tell them that we are going to be clicking and dragging images or phrases onto the slide to correctly match the cause and effect relationship. So this is kind of cool, but they would open it up, and then I have them put their hands on their head, so I know that they're not going to try to start before I tell them what to do, because kids always try to do that, always. Not even kids, adults still do that. But 9 times out of 10, if a kid does that, they're probably not doing it right. And then it prevents a headache if you just have those little check-ins. And then also it kind of gives you an idea of who needs more time to get in or if somebody needs help logging in. So this slide would be kind of like my guided practice. So I would tell them, well, first I would show them how to use it. So if you notice, your causes are on the left side and your effects are on the right side. And you have a bank of images that you're going to use to correctly identify cause and effect relationships. So then we kind of talk together, and then we would say, oh, what is this? A rain cloud. And we'd say, what's a possible effect that could happen because of the rain cloud? What do you guys think? Toothbrush. It's Man, you wouldn't brush your teeth very often. So the correct response would be an umbrella, and then we would just kind of go through and finish doing this one together. And then I would have them practice actually physically doing it themselves, so I can see that they know how to use this, click buttons, because it's kind of tricky for kids to click and drag at the same time. It's tough. And so we would do this for our guided practice, and then I would have them do this one on their own, and then when they finish, raise their hand, and then I'll come by and check, because that kind of gives me one last check-in before they're completely turned loose to make sure that they know what they're doing. And then for my differentiation, you can kind of see there's a bit of a progression. So it starts off kind of simple. There's just some images. And then it starts to include words and images, just text. And then this would be for like my high flyers. So I like to call those like super smart kiddos. This is where they would be able to actually type in their own response. So in this lesson, we planned thinking that this was going to be like so much for them to do, and all of them completely blew it out of the water. They were like so amazing. So we were like, okay. And that's one of those times I'm going to tell you right now that like 99% of the time your lesson plan is not going to go how you plan it. So we were like thinking that this was going to be so much, and all of them were like complete rock stars. They're so smart. But we like to think so. I'll go back into my little slide. So this is kind of how you can see like some clear differentiation. In some lessons, it's going to be a little bit more difficult to kind of figure out how to differentiate. But something like this, there's just kind of a progression. In my measurable assessment, I just wanted them to do as many correctly as they could in the time that they had. So there wasn't like, they didn't need to finish all of the slides. It was just whatever they could get to and if they were accurate. So that way you can kind of change your expectations depending on their kind of where they're at as learners. So why do you think it's important to lesson plan? What do you guys think?
So it's not all over it.
Yeah, it's a good one. I'm pointing at you with my clipboard. No, this isn't a clipboard, it's a keyboard.
As you were mentioning earlier, having out your list, your materials and stuff, especially if you, for some reason, need somebody to come in who may be experienced but doesn't know exactly how you run your classroom or what you have planned, this helps them.
Yeah.
That is a starting point.
Yeah, and a lot of your professors, if you do come to Eastern, are going to tell you when you're filling out your lesson plan, you want it to be detailed enough so that if someone needed to come and teach your lesson, they would know exactly what it is that they're doing and exactly what the students need to be doing.
Probably to reduce stress too, because if you have everything planned out, you're not like the day of at your prep time before your kids come in like, I don't know what I'm gonna do, like I didn't finish it.
Yep.
Everything.
Yep, it kind of relieves that stress.
I was thinking that like if you have to have a certain amount of knowledge spread out to the kids by like a certain date to have a test, you could have that evenly spread out through the days.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you can keep track of what standards you've addressed and be sure that all of them.
Yeah. Other ideas?
A method to the madness.
Yes, definitely. So I asked, is all of this really necessary? Because that lesson plan, it looks a little bit intimidating at first. Essentially, yes, it is. I said we learn to crawl before we learn to run, right? So it's important to be able to know how to fill out that crazy long lesson plan and know all of those components. So that way you know that you know what it takes to do a lesson and kind of hit all of those things. Because the more practice you have lesson planning and then actually teaching, a lot of that stuff that you type up and you plan, it's just going to be like, just like second nature. It's just going to become part of your natural practice. And a lot of those things that you do to like accommodate for certain learners, you're just going to automatically know what they're going to need in a lesson. And especially the more time you spend with a class, you're going to know exactly what Delaney needs. I'm going to know exactly what Chris needs. And I'll be able to kind of accommodate that when I'm figuring out what I'm going to be teaching. I kind of touched on that. And I said practice makes progress, not perfection, because perfection is impossible to get as much as we want to be there. Believe me, I really want to be there. This is just something I pulled off the internet. Benefits of lesson planning. Some of us kind of came up with these ideas. It provides some guidance. It helps you clarify those learning objectives so you can really be explicit about what you're teaching so you know exactly what your students are going to be learning. It improves the quality of lessons because if you plan and kind of prep before, it's going to really improve the quality of your instruction. Like even if you're just presenting a video, if you haven't watched the video beforehand and like kind of planned when to stop and pause for questions and kind of give them time to talk, you just won't really get the same the same educational experience out of it, if that kind of makes sense. You can visualize the entire teaching process, and then it makes learning easier for students. This is kind of my progression with my experience with lesson planning. Complete intimidation was my starting point. I was like, oh my gosh. And then the more practice I had, I was still super uncertain about what I was doing. I would literally take hours to fill out that lesson plan, and that's not necessary. It shouldn't take you that long. But I was like, I don't know if I'm doing this right. Yeah. And then I kind of felt more comfortable with the lesson plan, but I was like way still overdoing it, like completely giving myself a script. And that tends to be a bad idea if you're doing a complete script in a lesson plan, because then it's going to make you want to stare at your lesson plan and say what you have planned rather than just kind of flowing with things. And then this is my experience. I got more comfortable and I was able to kind of still get the same ideas across, but they were more condensed and I wasn't providing a very specific script anymore. There's some things, like if I were to be writing a lesson plan and I wanted somebody else to teach it, like if I was going to be gone and the sub needed to teach it, there might be certain things that you really want them to stress, like if they're teaching a new vocabulary word, like, ooh, say this, say this, say this. But as far as like from 3 o'clock to 4 o'clock, by the minute, this is what you need to be saying at that time, it's just not logical. And now, in my student teaching experience, I became way more comfortable with just getting up in front and teaching without a lesson plan sitting in front of me. And you kind of get to a point where you don't really need to fill out that super lengthy lesson plan. And it would just take way more time, right? So a lot of those strategies and things that you're learning while you're figuring out the lesson planning process, they're always in your toolbox. And then you get confidence. And there are still times, like when you're going through a teacher preparation program, like at Eastern, where you're going to need to fill out those lesson plans. Like this year, I would have to fill them out for observations and things like that, so that my university supervisor, my mentor teacher, when they're observing my teaching, they know that I had things planned, right? They know that I was accounting for all of the different learners in my classroom, and I had measurable learning goals. But as far as like my day-to-day teaching, I didn't need to write a lesson plan for every single content area. Some ending notes. I feel like I've just been like, blah, 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 blah. I don't normally teach older people. They're normally like this. So great planning ensures students are being given sufficient opportunities to grow as learners. So making sure that you're planning so you know what students need and you're kind of giving them that best experience. Planning is crucial to developing your confidence as an educator. And I kind of said this earlier, but 9 times out of 10, a lesson is not going to go how you had planned. You just kind of learn to roll with it and be flexible. I can even think of an example today when Tanya's presentation wasn't showing on the screen. You just kind of learn to be flexible and roll with it, right? Because if you just stand and go, oh my gosh, everyone's going to be like, well, now what? And then practice, practice, practice. With that, are there any questions? I know it was a lot. Yeah.
More of like a specific, not necessarily about lesson plans, but if it was a college thing or a school-based thing. But growing up, the SMART goals that they had us do, is that something that the college taught or that the school taught the teachers to do? Like, are those the type of things that in the teaching program, those are some of the tips that they go over? Is abbreviations like that?
In my experience, I've had a couple of ed professors who have done SMART goals, but a lot of times I think that's more in like the health and wellness kind of side of things where they do those specific SMART goals. I don't know if that really answers your question.
And sometimes you'll have schools that develop a certain philosophy or they develop a certain way that they want their teachers to do that. And they may have just simply adopted that as something that they wanted all their students to do.
Yeah.
So as you get more comfortable doing it, do your lessons plans, they don't seem quite as strict. do you then instead change your scope? So instead of being like down to the minute, it's more, okay, in these 3 days, this is kind of my lesson plan, and you can fill in the gaps from there.
I think it kind of depends. I think it depends on like what you're wanting to teach. Because like, I can think of an example. I had to teach my kids area this year. And so you have to start like very, very small in the beginning, like kind of just like, what is area? Why would you need to know area? And then like really going over how you count every single like square inch inside. We used Cheez-Its. And so they would put the Cheez-Its inside of the squares. And so you really just kind of sometimes need to plan that small progression. But like with older kids, like high school, you might not need to do it like so small. I think it really depends.
Sure.
Also understand with a lot of the programs that districts follow, say like a math program, they will have, everything kind of broken up and they will have kind of a sequential base to them. And so teachers use that a lot. And they use those lesson books as places where they can write down things like, this went well, or this needs to be explained more specifically. And so you are given some tools for that. And as Jill noted, we stress the lesson plan so you get comfortable with it. And so you become to the point where it becomes almost second nature, and you can go, okay, so like for instance, towards the end of my grouping, I had a planning book, and it would go through my day, and I would have what I was doing. But there were no like lesson plans for each one of them. But I was also aware of, okay, what I needed to cover for English, and math and whatnot. But I didn't write down the standards. Now, there are some schools where the teachers would do that. They would make the teachers, the principal would come in and look at your lesson plan book and like, you had to have that standard written down next to it. It varies from school to school. And I think most principals, not all, but most principals have gotten to that point where if they're hiring someone like this and they've spent time in the classroom, I think they have confidence in the role of the teacher to be able to direct their own lessons. Okay.
Cool. Thanks.